Um, thank you for coming back to our third meeting tonight. Um, just a few housekeeping things before we get started. It would be really great if each of you could write into the chat two things, just to get a sense of where everybody's at. One thing that you may have learned or took away from Zainab's presentation last week, it can be something small, big, it could be a feeling, it could be a piece of knowledge. However, however you feel and whatever you think best represents your takeaway, it's all good. And because we're in the internet world, we'd love to know where you're signing in from. It's always nice to know where people are. Secondly, just as a point of reference, our Morgan State students, who are Morgan State students in Dr. Morales's class, are going to be in breakout rooms with each other this evening, and then for the duration of the mini course. They're doing a lot of work with Dr. Morales, and they're processing things in class and here that we want to give and respect. We want to give them an opportunity and respect that opportunity to unpack things in relation to other things that they're learning. And so tonight we're going to look at a particular Jewish view of economic justice. And I know that, or I hope you brought a lot of questions. I asked you to read a biblical text that doesn't seem to relate to economic injustice, at least intuitively. And the reason why we'll look at this text is so you can get a sense of how rabbis, and when I say rabbis, I'm going to be talking about a group of people in the Mediterranean between the 2nd to maybe the 9th century. It's debatable. It could be the 3rd to the 6th century. Scholars are still trying to date the rabbis. That won't be our work tonight. Our work will be to try to understand how they interpret texts. And we're going to look at an interpretation of the Sodom and Gomorrah text. I also asked you to read, and I apologize, it was a lengthy article on equality. But why I wanted you to read this particular article in relation to the text that we're reading tonight is that each of us is bringing very informed and very thoughtful views on what we think individualism and egalitarianism is. We're bringing views of the difference between intuition and argument. A lot of us think about the differences between treating people equally as opposed to maybe treating them as equals and the tension there. And I think what this article does rather nicely is show that there's no panacea. There's no one way that we can solve this problem, and that each of us brings an experience, wisdom, and intelligence to this problem that sometimes contradicts others. And this article shows that people who are in the contemporary political conservative movement and the contemporary liberal political movement offer things that the author thinks are helpful, and things that are irreconcilable, and things that he would like to critique. And so it's a way to bring us into this conversation tonight, to know that you're not going to walk away with an answer. And that people are still struggling with this contemporary problem. So when you bring this to the religious text tonight, it's coming with a certain level of empathy and respect that we're trying to unpack this together. Another caveat. This is a transition place in the course because you've learned from my two colleagues, two extraordinary thinkers in the Muslim and Catholic traditions. And we are now moving towards broader understanding of traditions and forcing a certain practical application in a contemporary context. That means you're going to have strong opinions. Maybe some of you don't, but those of you that do, you might feel a little angry when you are engaging in conversation with your others. I just want to tell you that that's okay. Just don't let that anger silence everyone else in the room. The facilitators are going to help us in this conversation, but just take a deep breath. Let others' views come in and inform how you might respond, but don't. It's okay to be angry because these are passionate topics. We want injustice to end, but everybody seems to understand that differently. So these are the caveats. So with that in mind, I'm going to start my PowerPoint. I just have to share my screen. And I'm going to look at the chat during the breakout room, if that's okay. Why? Okay, here we are. Sorry. All right, here we are. So everyone can see the screen. I need to play the slideshow to make it really work well. Can everyone see the screen, or is it look like a lot of slides? It does look like a lot of slides.
You're in presenter view, Ben.
Oh, all right, let me get out of that. Play from current slide. All right, here we go. All right, so let's get started. A Jewish view of economic justice. Just notice that I did not use the definite article, the Jewish view of economic justice, because no such definite article would be helpful, because there are myriad ways into how Jews understand economic justice, and struggling with what economic justice means is part of a rabbinic tradition, as we'll see tonight. But you're not going to come away with the as one view. So what are we going to do tonight? I'm going to set up the problem. I'm going to go over the Sodom and Gomorrah story very quickly. And the reason why I didn't choose a particular translation is that each of you reads this text from your own tradition, and I wanted to respect that. And also, translation is a complicated thing in sacred texts. And those of you who have taken classes with me in the past know that I love Hebrew grammar, and I love its relationship to Jewish theological expression and theology in general. But I only gave myself 10 minutes. But if you are interested in those questions, I am teaching a course on the life of dialogue on Martin Buber, who was a wonderful thinker in terms of these relationships. And we'll explore them in a 6-week course. So I did a plug tonight, so I'm going to pat myself on the back. So the Martin Buber course is going to be in a couple weeks where we will explore those tensions. But I'm going to set up the issue with Sodom and Gomorrah. You're going to go out to your breakout room. And in your breakout room, you're going to bring some of the issues of the equality text and the biblical text to the conversation. And then when we come back after some plenary and some digesting of our conversations, I want to offer a rabbinic interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah that puts it into the economic justice context. I want to show you how the rabbis do it, but I also want you to get a sense of what's at stake and why they do it. And then for 10 minutes, I'm going to put that in relationship with our contemporary economic predicament. So we all agree that inequality is bad, but what kind of equality is good? And that's going to be an issue. And then I'm going to play the Richard Reeves interview again. Some of you may have heard it already, some haven't. He makes a very provocative point in relation to what we'll be doing tonight. So that will be the springboard into our second conversation. We'll have a plenary and then some parting thoughts. All right, good. So let's get started. So Sodom and Gomorrah. So you read chapter 19. But what the Hebrew Bible has before that is this succinct sentence that says, now the inhabitants of Sodom were very wicked sinners against the Lord. And we learn that the land itself was incredibly lush, beautiful, and fertile. And so the land is going to be an issue in the rabbinic interpretation. In the story, we know that God tells Abraham of the plan to destroy the region. And as you remember, Abraham forcefully objects to the notion that God would do any sort of collective punishment. Right? And he's very clever in the way that he does that. So in your groups, think about how Abraham negotiates with God. The text itself seems to imply that there are no righteous people there. And this is interesting because if you remember a few chapters before that, when God uses the flood to destroy the world, God promises not to destroy the world again, but God doesn't promise not to destroy a particular community. And so we need to think about what is going on in the text when it comes to that particular tension. The story itself, I summed it up in a paragraph purposely with a certain ambiguity so that, that you can talk among your own translations in the group. But we know of two angels that proceed to Sodom disguised as impoverished travelers. And so that's important. And it's to help evacuate Lot and his family from a city that's going to be destroyed. When these two outsiders come into the town at dusk, Lot presses them urgently not to sleep in the street. Lot knows his neighbors. It's dangerous. Very quickly, a mob of every man in Sodom surrounds the house, demanding that the guests be turned over so that they can rape them. And so I also want you to think about how something that is essential to the act of creation and the act of intimacy can be used as a tool for violence. And so what is being done in that scenario in terms of reversing the creation that is good and turning it bad? And when Lot tries to plead and negotiate with them, calling them my brothers, they tell him to move aside and threaten to rape him too, even more brutally. What I leave out in this summary is something that I think in your group you need to also talk about. What did Lot offer as a way of protecting these two angels? What is so problematic about that offering? And what does that mean about Lot in his own context that he would make that kind of offering? And so they threaten to rape him more brutally if he continues to side with the foreigners and to talk to them. And they refer to him as an alien. So the word in Hebrew is bolagur, which it's actually two verbs. But a resident alien or a stranger. They refer to him as a stranger. And so this is how they're going to treat the stranger. So in your breakout room, we're going to start the evening with a question. And I want you to think about the article that you read beforehand, but I also want you to think about this particular text. What makes a society, a body politic, so irredeemably, unforgivably wicked that it must be destroyed? And we're thinking in terms of the biblical context for God, that there is not one redeemable soul, that it needs to be utterly wiped off the face of the earth. So what makes a society that evil? I throw in a second part of the question for those who are not coming out of the biblical text, or those that may not be operating from a belief in God or some transcendent judgment. What makes a society so wicked that it would inevitably destroy itself? It's flipping the same question. There's something so wicked and so evil that destruction is inevitable. So for the next 20 minutes in your groups, I want you to think about, talk about what, answer these questions. Keeping in mind that you don't have to be beholden to what you initially say. what the rabbis thought about this particular story and where the evil lies. And thankfully, this is one of the moments in rabbinic writing that the rabbis are actually very clear on the problem. And when I say that, those who have taken courses with us in the past know that the rabbis are very playful in how they try to understand sacred texts. And sometimes it can be enriching, and other times it can be infuriating. So what's important here, and this is linked back to Zainab's observation at the end of her class last week, is something that that I personally was trying to wrap my head around, is this idea that we have. And when I say we, I don't mean the people necessarily in this room, but as a society, the technological advancement is somehow coterminous, somehow similar with moral advancement, that the more technologically advanced the society is, the assumption is that there's a certain morality that goes along with that advancement. And think about the ways in which we talk about others who have less technology. I'm not going to give those examples now. I know that you know what they are. They're not very pleasant things to say, but morality doesn't mean that you get to enjoy an electric toothbrush or have advanced medicine. Moral advancement is something different. And unfortunately, it doesn't at least seem to have gone along with our technological advancement. So I think that's an important point to consider as we're unfolding some of these interpretations or grappling with them, because I think that point undergirds a lot of the interpretations that we're going to see tonight. So creation standing on one foot. This is a very important point of view in sort of addressing evil, at least rabbinically. Human beings created by God are the creators of their own culture. So in the covenant with God, human beings have responsibilities, God has a responsibility, but human beings create culture. And culture then is something that's passed down generationally, and that human beings live in history by the cultures that they create. How culture is understood, it could be as simple as the garments of language, but it also represents values and how we organize society. And generation after generation, how cultures sort of endure, come out of decisions made by people before them. So if the conditions by which culture are already unethical as they've unfolded throughout the centuries, it becomes harder and harder and harder for people to make ethical choices. And I think a lot of you can understand that problem when we talk about the history of slavery, when we talk about the history of genocide, of racism, of sexism, that we live in an individual moment that we may not actually harbor any of those views ourselves, but we know that those views play a role in the society and we live, and each of us responds to those views differently based on how we're perceived by others. And that for the rabbis, human beings did this. This is not a divine creation. This is a human creation. So the ethics in how we deal with this, good and bad, are of our own creation. So the Bible, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and then the rabbinic literature is a way of trying to find a way for humans to get back on the path. And just as a footnote, the word in Hebrew for Jewish law, halacha, it actually means a path or a way. And so we need to find our way. Secondly, for the rabbis, to be human, as opposed to other animals, is to be accountable. That relationships between humans are essential, and that for the rabbis, they are very different than animals and other species and how they relate to one another. And what makes human beings different for the rabbis in the Mishnah is that human beings are always held responsible for our actions. And when we say held responsible for our actions, it's usually our actions toward other people. And the way that I was trying to think of examples of how to show this, an interview came to my mind with Margaret Mead, right? The anthropologist. I think that's who it was. Where she was asked, what's the difference between a human being and any other animal? And she goes through this long explanation about an animal breaking its femur. Whereas a human being, that if you break your femur, you're not doomed to death because other human beings will help you. In the animal kingdom, she said, most of the time, you're never going to recover and you'll be food for some other animal, right? So this idea that human beings in their relationships with one another makes them unique. And that there's something about the image of God that plays a role in these relationships. How much do you want the image of God and the life of God to influence your decisions between people? How much do you want your own needs to influence your relationships? And how much do you want sort of a godly need to influence those relationships? So it's a balance for the rabbis. And so that leads to a definition of freedom that is not intuitive, at least in Western thinking. Freedom is not you get to think about whatever you want at any time, at any place, or do whatever you want at any time, in any place. It means that we can't decide whether or not we're responsible for others. That's not freedom. The meaning of freedom is we can decide whether or not we choose to live up to that responsibility. For the rabbis, there's an intuition. We know we are responsible and accountable to others, because if we entered the world without help from other peoples, we wouldn't be on the world very long. That there's and again, they make this relationship to the animal kingdom, that a deer is born and is raised by parents, and that time of need is much shorter than it is for a human. And so they like to use those sort of analogies, as imperfect as they are. But freedom means you can choose to live up to the responsibility of being a human being, or you don't. And so to be a part of Jewish tradition in this sense is to argue for justice in relationship to that human freedom and to plead for mercy. So if we follow Abraham's example, you need to argue with God. You need to argue with people. You need to speak up in the face of injustice. What's so remarkable about that passage in Sodom and Gomorrah is how much Abraham is willing to argue with God because he thinks God is doing the wrong thing. But there's something really troubling about the idea that human beings can't be redeemed or corrected and must be destroyed, that they had reached a place that was irredeemable. And Abraham was reminding God of God's covenant to God's creation and to God's people. And so somehow human freedom is understood in the context that you don't get to choose the situations in which you need to plead for mercy and argue for justice. That you have to be prepared for it. So as a footnote to that, some people think about religion as being on a journey. For the rabbis, it's not a journey. It's being ready. And that's very different. So the prophets usually, when they respond to God's call to them, they say, Hineni, here I am. And it has the understanding that I'm ready to do. I'm ready to do what's called of me in that moment. And according to Jewish ethics then, in a society where some are oppressed, all of us are implicated regardless. Because think back to that culture moment. If we're not free to decide whether or not we want to be accountable or responsible to one another, but rather we choose to live up to that responsibility, it means that if there is some oppression in this world, we're somehow all responsible for it. That there's no such thing as an innocent bystander. Whether you're benefiting from that oppression, whether you're suffering from that oppression, the rabbis remind you at every moment, even in ritual. We have the Passover Seder coming up, in which Jews are reminded that they were slaves in Egypt, but now they are free. But they're also reminded that they're not free until slavery is eradicated. And so it's this dialectic between oppression and being oppressed. And as long as that dynamic exists in the world, where there are oppressors and oppressed, we are not living up to our responsibility as beings, even if it's not our issue, it's not our concern. And that's where the tension between individualism and egalitarianism play a role for the rabbis. And so there's this idea that the God of the Torah is the God of the oppressed. So we find countless examples in the Torah of God choosing the side of the oppressed. Even Hagar, the Egyptian, the maidservant, her name literally means the stranger, is the only one, and she's not Israelite, she's Egyptian, and she's oppressed by the patriarch Abraham and the matriarch Sarah. She is the only one in the Hebrew Bible that gets to actually name God. And she calls God El Roi, the God who sees me. So I can be invisible to all people, but I always know that God will see me. So this vision extends to economics and politics too. And so this is important. The rabbinic tradition doesn't know the difference or the nuances of capitalism or socialism or communism or any of the other economic systems that came into being in the 19th century. That's just not part of their worldview. And so I've read people that want to make the rabbis capitalists or socialists, and those things are interesting. But I think what's more helpful is to know that the Torah's vision of life extends to our economics. And thinking about that freedom of being responsible to other people. So another thing that we need to know is that the Torah is not a privatized religion, but a social vision, right? It's not an ascetic distancing from the world, but a deep engagement with and enmeshment in the messy realities of living together day in and day out. So to be a religious person in Judaism is a wonderful experience, but it comes with a lot of struggle, because the world in Jewish tradition is not redeemed until creation is complete, and creation is complete when justice prevails. And Jewish tradition is really, to a great extent, and if I were to summarize it, it's about learning to live with other people. Point simply, a lot of the laws, even in relationship to God, is trying to figure out the best way for people to live with one another. And so the Israelites are called to build a society in which the weak are protected from those who would prey on them, and which poverty is robbed of its tyrannical power, and in which people see one another across lines of wealth, prestige, status, and as family. This is really important in a contemporary environment, because we don't do that. There are certain assumptions about people who are wealthy and poor, at least in our current economic context, that do not see us as family, but in fact see us as different, as other. And what's interesting is who we attach wisdom to in these lines of difference, which we'll get back to, and the rabbis have something to say about. And so the Israelites' fidelity to Torah will be measured in large part by the kind of society and by the kinds of social relationships they create. So in other words, if human beings have this wonderful opportunity to create culture and society, they're going to be judged by it. That is how we understand God's place in the world, is our ability to bring God into the world and to make it a just world. And the Torah itself teaches us that it's a very difficult path, because the person who created cities and the person who created the infrastructure for human beings to work together to build is Cain, who is also the human being who invented murder. So what better way to see that technology and advancement in technology doesn't always lead to advancement in morality. And so ultimately the character of Israel's life is intended to reflect the character of the God it worships. So with that in mind, What are the root causes of sodomite behavior? What happened in Sodom? How did it get destroyed? And what was the responsibility of people with one another to either prevent that or to cause it? So the rabbis, the first thing they do is they look to the Hebrew Bible itself for a clue. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel offers a commentary, offers an interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah that becomes very helpful for the rabbis. Only this was the sin of your sister Sodom, arrogance. She and her daughters had plenty of bread and untroubled tranquility, yet she did not support the poor and needy, and in their haughtiness they committed abomination before me, and so I removed them, as you saw. So Ezekiel sees the problem in that they didn't support the poor, and they had plenty of bread and untroubled tranquility, which is I imagine, a really lovely state of being. Untroubled tranquility. We think of tranquility, we think of it in momentary opportunities. This is untroubled. And then I just thought this picture summed it up very nicely. A poor Leonardo DiCaprio. I have nothing against Leo, but this was a helpful picture to sort of show the sin of Sodom. Plenty of bread, untroubled tranquility, not supporting the poor and the needy. And then you have Leo. I'm sorry, Leo. So then in the Babylonian Talmud, in Sanhedrin, the rabbis are going to unpack that connection with Ezekiel. And I put this cartoon here because it actually very helpfully it's helpful in describing what the rabbis are going to argue. The people of Sodom became arrogant before the Holy One only from the goodness that God had provided for them. The people of Sodom said, since food comes out from our land, and gold and silver come out from our land, and precious stones and pearls come out from our land, we have no need for other people to come to us. They come to us only to empty us out. Let us take a stand to make strangers forgotten among us. The Holy One said to them, since with the goodness that I've provided you, you have made strangers forgotten among you, I will make you forgotten from the world. They believed that the goodness from the land was theirs, that it wasn't coming from God. And there was this misperception out of the luck of being in that land that they conflated it with ownership. They owned it, it was for them and not for others, as opposed to going back to the idea that seeing people across lines of difference, it was for everyone. That land was for everyone. The bounty for that land is for everyone. And the problem is they hoarded it. They made it for themselves only. And therefore they also didn't trust people who came into their land as anything other than people who want to take the valuable resources that had nothing to do with the people who lived there. Those valuable resources belong to the earth and to God alone. But they hoarded them, they took them, they made it their own, and created a system by which they understood their self-worth based on these material items. Some might call that idolatry. We'll get to that. So for the rabbis, the root causes of the sin of Sodom were wealth hoarding. So the idea that you hoard things for yourself and people within your own circumscribed society or community, and you operate on the assumption that it is owed and owed to you and that you deserve it, and at the same time understanding that others do not deserve it in the same way. So they hoarded wealth. And it's a worldview that suggests that my fortune and wealth reflects a greater value or worth than others. That the more resources I have, the more economic wealth that I have, means that I am myself am more valuable as a human being. And that society starts to reflect that. So remember when I pointed to who we value in terms of wisdom, a society that values the rich is going to value the wisdom of the rich. And what is the wisdom of the rich for the rabbis? To stay rich. Or why don't you come and join me and imagine the wonderful world that we have at the expense of others. So this is where it's going to get controversial and a little bit pointed. The passage in Sanhedrin continues with a list of the sinful sodomite rules. So the rabbis are going to explain what the culture and society became as a result of their decisions. That the law of Sodom benefited property owners over orphans. So if I were say in Baltimore City, landlords over renters, rich over poor. And the reason why I say that is a hot issue in Baltimore City right now. Rich over poor, locals over travelers. This is an important issue. Who gets to be a local? Who gets to be a traveler? And who owns the land of the society? These are questions that are always going to lead, at least for the rabbis, to unethical decisions and answers. And then finally, criminals over crime victims. They valued criminals over crime victims. The city went so far as to criminalize giving to the needy and meted out cruel punishments to those who attempted to share food with the hungry. It sounds hyperbolic. I recognize that. But I wanted to share this picture of you of a border patrolman who is emptying out canisters of water that are left at the border for people who are trying to get into the United States illegally. And so it is illegal to leave water in the wilderness for those that are trying to get in. And there are Border Patrol agents that go out of their way to empty out the water. And so when we think about the society that we want to create and the us and them dichotomy that we imagine for ourselves, borders are human creations. Countries are human creations. Human beings that want opportunity and safety is something universal. But somehow we in a society could justify legally the actions of this individual as something essential and good. That is exactly what the rabbis are talking about in the root causes of the sin of Sodom. So hopefully things are starting to catalyze in your mind in terms of how provocative the rabbis are going to be in what the sin of Sodom is and whether or not we as a society are still going down that route. And not to be undone in their acts of provocation. The rabbis want to understand how human beings operate in the world, and they've decided that there are 4 types of character, 4 characteristics in human beings and how they relate to property. I used to joke with students and even my kids that I'd say there are 2 types of people in the world. People who say there are 2 types of people and people who don't. I'll assume you laughed. I always found that kind of funny. So the first trait says that mine is mine and yours is yours, and that this is a commonplace type. And some say this is a Sodom type of character. So interesting, because most of us seem to agree with that. One says, mine is yours and yours is mine. This is an unlearned person, Am Haaretz, the Amcha. And what that means is a person that is uncultured and acts according to her or his passions and not reason, which is interesting. An unlearned person is saying what's mine is yours and yours is mine. That seems to be a nice idea. One that says mine is yours and yours is yours. This is a pious person. The pious person is able to see that material items, material wealth are ephemeral and don't judge the character of a human being at all. And that really one's way in the world is a relationship with God and with justice and making the world a better place. And so any type of possession that I need and have to hold on to is going to create a characteristic in me that's idolatrous, because eventually God becomes that object that I need and that I owned. and that I hold over others. So the pious person is letting go of objects out of a fear of idolatry because you don't want God to become your object. And then one that says mine is mine and yours is mine. And this is obviously a wicked person. So we have these 4 traits, but the Sodom type is the most common. So we'll unpack it. And this is what we'll call the sin of economic disempowerment. It's all mine. If one benefiting from my property would cause me any real financial loss or harm, then it is normal, common behavior to prevent it. What's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. Back off. We both can't have the cereal. We both can't live in my house. We both can't drive my car, right? There are certain things in a functioning society that need to create these kinds of boundaries. So if it's going to cause me real financial harm or loss for you to take my car, you can't have it. And it would, right? I'm not in a position to get another car. So back off. However, if I prevent you from benefiting from my financial well-being, even though I would not stand to lose anything through your prosperity, then I embody the Sodom type of character, because I'm not concerned with my own security, but only with preventing yours. So to make this provocative, I get to enjoy some really good healthcare because of the work of my wife and me. And there's a feeling in that our healthcare, we deserve it because we work hard. But if it was universal, would I lose my healthcare? Right. So you could then get into the weeds and say, well, in terms of policy, it might not be as good. But would I lose my healthcare? The answer is no. Right. So what do I have to lose by others gaining something? And I use that because it's a hot button issue. And you can translate that to others. But what the rabbis are saying is, stop thinking about yourself. Right? Your needs are the same as everyone else's. So it's a way of teaching empathy. So how do we prevent another Sodom and Gomorrah? So there's a long-standing principle in Jewish law that mandates a court intervene to compel people not to obstruct other people's flourishing. The word flourishing is really important here because it's ambiguous. Does flourishing have to do with the right to education? Does flourishing have the right to health care? What are the human rights involved in allowing a human being to flourish on her or his terms? The rabbis make that ambiguous enough so that the law itself can grow with the society. So however you define flourishing, you need to interpret the law to meet that answer. And we cannot obstruct other people's flourishing. And if I'm going to put a footnote to make it even more provocative, in our country, Americans prevented the flourishing, and that's really saying it euphemistically, right, of an entire people for 400 years. And some would say even till to today, that the legacy of enslaved people is part of that evil of Sodom, but it was obstructing other people's flourishing at its basic core. Right? So that's why they wouldn't support that type of economic system. And you would say, aha, but in the Bible, there is support for slavery. But the interesting thing for the rabbis is that the Bible's the foundation, but the living word of God and law comes through the interpretations of it. And this comes through also a fear of idolatry, that if it's one interpretation for all time and for all lands, that means you've created an object, an idol. If God is beyond our ability to know and God's beyond our ability to even imagine, you would not reduce God to one human interpretation in any one period of time and live that throughout history. It requires a constant relationship, a constant unpacking. So we cannot obstruct another people's flourishing. And Jewish law intervenes to prevent anyone from placing obstruction to another person's flourishing when the damage to their flourishing the only damaging does to their flourishing is cutting into my sense of superiority. So the rabbis are concerned with this idea that the more wealth you attain, the more sense of superiority that you have over other people. So I'll throw in another provocative example. You know, Bill Gates has attained a lot of wealth, and he's now deciding how best to distribute education. That as a result of his wealth and his philanthropy, we're willing to say that he has some expertise in an area that he might not. I'm not suggesting that necessarily as a critique of Mr. Gates, but I am suggesting that the rabbis understand this really deeply, that we're willing to give a lot of charity to those, at least intellectually, when they have amassed a lot of wealth. And so there is a principle in rabbinic law, kofin al midat Sodom. We block attempts to behave like Sodom. We create laws. We create values that prevent people from acting on their worst impulses, so that we can repair society, we can repair culture, and we can move ourselves in a different direction. So kofin al midat Sodom. And then finally, the final example is how this happens in practice. So in the Shulchan Aruch, a 16th century text by Yosef Karo, he simply says, siblings or partners who have come to a field to divide a field, each one taking one share, if it's all completely equal, then they divide it according to size. So far, so good. If one said, give me my share on this side, so it will be connected to my other field, and it will be one field, we listen to them and we enforce this. For preventing this is a trait of Sodom. For preventing this is a state of trouble, because I'm still getting the same field as you are, but you have the opportunity to connect it to another field. I don't lose anything by it, right? And so that's contentious, right? So I'm not suggesting you have to agree with it, but that's an understanding of egalitarianism that's going to come out of the rabbinic imagination. Okay, to the work, because we're going to go to our breakout rooms in a minute. So in the article, we have this paragraph that I lifted for you. In 2014, the Pew Research Center asked Americans to rank the greatest dangers in the world. A plurality put inequality first, ahead of religious and ethnic hatred, nuclear weapons, and environmental degradation. And yet people don't agree about what exactly equality means. The complexities of egalitarianism are especially frustrating because inequalities are so easy to grasp. CEOs on average make almost 300 times what their employees make. Billionaire donors shape our politics. Automation favors owners over workers. Urban economies grow while rural areas stagnate. The best healthcare goes to the richest. Today, there are premier lines for popcorn at the movies and 5 tiers of Uber. We still struggle to address obvious inequalities of all kinds based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and other aspects of identity. Inequality is everywhere and unignorable. We've diagnosed the disease. Why can't we agree on the cure? And this is where I think the charity in the conversation is important. If we've agreed on the disease, which is fairly difficult to do these days, then why can't we agree on a cure? So it comes back to this question that I asked at the beginning. Should we treat people equally or as equals? And there's a subtle difference that I think that most of you are starting to get with this. Looking at the time, I don't think I'm going to play the Richard Reeves interview, and I'm going to summarize it so that you can go to your breakout rooms, and I hope that's okay. It's only a few minutes, but I've already shown that I'm not great with my technology, which then maybe you can infer that because my technology isn't advancing, maybe my morality is. I'll just assume you laughed at that too. I want to make some jokes, but what are you going to do? So I'll leave some of you may have heard it already, but he makes the simple argument that we actually don't agree on the cure because we refuse to see who benefits from the inequality. And for him, it's the upper 20% of the upper middle class, the people who make $100,000 a year or more. And he calls them the dream hoarders. That these are the folks that are not necessarily amassing wealth, they're amassing opportunities, meaning through their networks, through their relationships, they're able to get their kids to the best schools, to get them internships, to get them good education. And by doing this, for Richard Reeves, it's actually advancing inequality because it's making the playing field even more unequal because a lot of families, especially kids, don't have the same opportunity. And so he makes a fairly strong critique of what he calls the upper middle class, so the economically the top 20%. So if he is correct, and that the upper middle class are unconsciously dream hoarders, right? So I would have to put myself in that category as a dream hoarder, in that my kids go to good schools. It's the assumption they're going to go to college. There's a network of people who can help them make achievement there. I have a network of people who can help me, and that network is a tight network and doesn't include many people outside of it. It's exclusive, but it's not material wealth, right? I told you I have a small car, and if you stole it from me, I would not be able to replace it, but I am hoarding something. Would I fall into the category of sodomites? Am I a sodomite? Am I prevent by my very being and not changing the conditions of that going in the way of sodomites? And I think this is the reason why I'm asking this question, is that the hoarding of material wealth is easy to see people far away because most of us don't really have that kind of wealth. But a lot of us have that kind of connection and opportunity. And think of things like racism and sexism. If you're a man, if you're a woman, if you're white, if you are a person of color, the opportunities and dreams are being, for some people, a given, and for others taken away. So would they fall into the category of sodomites? And if not, why? So you can try to say that Reeves is incorrect. Or you could say that he's correct, but dream hoarders are not the same as wealth hoarders, and that dream hoarders are okay. But if yes, how could we as a community or society implement the rabbinic rule of kofin al midat Sodom, block attempts to behave like Sodom? How do we stop this behavior when hoarding goes beyond measurable wealth? How do we stop that behavior if in fact Reeves is correct? Could this principle be applied to hoarding opportunities? If not, why? If yes, how? Now, I know that your heads are spinning a lot from the last one. And if there was some unfinished business from the last conversation, feel free to continue that, but at least give it a shot. Think about it. Hoarding opportunities and wealth. How are they preventing us from meeting a just society?